Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, the podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Meslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on Carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Don Montes is the author of the Hypercarnivore Diet book with the subtitle, Eat Meat, Get Healthy, Plants Optional. He's also the founder of Full Range Strength, a blog and YouTube channel on using bodyweight and band-resisted exercise to build strength and muscle with minimal time and financial investment. Don switched to a hypercarnivore diet in mid-2017 after decades of practicing and authoring books on plant-based diets to relieve his psoriasis and eczema. He's improved his skin, digestive health, and body composition dramatically. The Hypercarnivore Diet is one of, if not the best book written on the carnivore diet and goes in depth on many important topics such as micronutrients, sustainable sourcing, common myths, and much more. Welcome to the show, Don.
Thank you, Scott. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's great. Well, would love to just start with, I'm sure folks are wondering who haven't read the book, what is a hypercarnivore diet and why do you choose to talk about it and adopt such a diet versus a more traditional 100% animal-based diet?
Okay, so I use the term hypercarnivore. It's from biology. Biologists distinguish different categories of carnivores among the animal kingdom. So, and we belong to the animal kingdom, of course. So they identify hypocarnivores, which consume 30% or less of their diet as meat, mesocarnivores, which get 50 to 70% of their sustenance from meat, and hypercarnivores, which get 70% or more of their sustenance from meat. I use and prefer that term because, as far as I know, there are few terrestrial carnivores which never consume any plants. So some plants sneak in their diet at various times. Wolves eat berries. There's even some berries that have been named after wolves. The wolfberry, also known as lychee berry or goji berry, is actually the Latin name, or the common name, wolfberry, is derived from the fact that wolves will eat these berries. So, and in the summer, it's been documented they'll eat other plant material as well. So I'm trying to be consistent with what the terminology that biologists use. And also, I'm not convinced that we have good evidence that humans are exclusive carnivores, since not even wolves or big cats are necessarily exclusive carnivores all the time. I'm doubtful that humans are adapted to an exclusive carnivore diet for the long term. Whether an exclusive carnivore diet might be beneficial for therapeutic purposes for a period of time, but whether it's optimal for the long term is a big question.
Yeah, I really like that classification and the use of the term. One, because it's rooted in biology, as you note, and also because it allows people to emphasize animal protein and animal foods in their diet without having to go all the way to carnivore if they don't feel ready to do that or prefer not to. So that's excellent. And Don, I know you expand on this in your book, so I'll save kind of the full version for that if folks are curious, but would love to hear kind of high level what made you adopt a plant-based diet before and what made you switch to a hypercarnivore diet.
Okay, well, I'll try to put it in a nutshell so we don't take up the whole time on that topic. Because I first adopted a plant-based diet back when I was around 20 years of age, which would have been about 1981 when I was in college. And I was convinced primarily from one angle, which was at that time, sports nutritionists were moving in the direction of recommending a high carbohydrate diet for sports performance. And I was interested in optimizing my sports performance. And I got a hold of a book. I don't know if it's still in print, but it's called the Sports Medicine Book by Gabe Merkin, who's still active in sports medicine today. And he basically recommended a mostly plant-based diet with very little animal products. And from several other books on sports medicine, I got the idea that was going to be the best for sports performance. And then I was influenced. I was a student of philosophy. I got my first degree in bachelor's degree and my first master's degree in philosophy. And I was influenced by ethical arguments in favor of reducing animal products in the diet, as well as at that time, I think it was approximately that time that Francis Moore Lepay's book, Diet for a Small Planet, came out. And I was susceptible to the reasoning at the time, didn't know enough about nutrition that would dissuade me from trying it. So I got embarked on the path of being a vegetarian, around that time. And from there, I got into, learned about people who were using plant-based diets allegedly for medical purposes, I guess you could say, for healing diseases. So there was macrobiotics, and then there were, I cannot remember the name of the guy right now, but it was a naturopath who had written several books. I was heavily influenced by him. He was basically advocating a lacto-vegetarian diet as alleged to be beneficial for healing diseases of civilization. So that's kind of how I got started on it. And then ended up being convinced that plants were what was missing from my parents' generation's diet. Because I grew up on a pretty good standard American diet. I mean, my mom made home cooked meals most of the time, and she's quite a good cook. But they were fairly heavy in meat. We regularly bought a side of beef from friends of my parents who were farmers who raised beef in Michigan. So the constellation of things I was exposed to convinced me that it was, at that time, we were starting to hear about cholesterol and saturated fat being bad for you and all of that. So the constellation of influences I was exposed to convinced me that the most prudent course was to cut meat out of my diet. So I did that. And then that set me on a path of the belief that a plant-based diet was ideal, whether I included or didn't include animal products, or what degree I included animal products in the diet. And the next, that's 81, up through the time that I was paleo for about 10 years, during which my first wife and I published a book, The Garden of Eating, subtitled A Produce-Dominated Diet and Cookbook, because I had the idea that a Paleolithic diet was, by volume, mostly fruits and vegetables, related to how, other primates eat, consuming lots of fruits and vegetables. And that's, more or less suggested by Lauren Cordain and others who promote a paleo diet as something distinct from a ketogenic diet. And then my most recent attempt to make a vegan animal food free diet work, which was about 5 years. So that's a nutshell of how I got started, and without going into all the details of the different evolutions and different methods I tried to apply a plant-based diet with and without animal foods in order to get some relief from my psoriasis, up until I realized roughly 2 years ago that the only thing that I really had never tried, because I had this strong belief that fruits and vegetables at least had to be good for me, was to restrict my plant food intake.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And how has the carnivore diet helped you and your wife once you've gone through this whole 180, Don?
Well, every time I especially tried a 100% plant-based diet, but even when I consumed a very high plant-rich diet like paleo, I had a modicum to some degree of digestive discomfort. I was convinced of the value of superfoods, and so I ate a lot of kale and collards and other greens, so a lot of leafy green vegetables with fiber, and a lot of other vegetables or with fiber as well as fruit. And I always had more or less gas and bloating, it being the worst when plant foods were the exclusive part of my diet, and somewhat less when there was some presence of animal foods taking up some of the space. But when I really restricted plant foods to less than 10% of my diet, or roughly 10%, 15% of my diet, I suddenly had relief from all of those gas, bloating, explosive stools, that kind of thing. That's the way excess fiber in plant food affected my digestive tract. And then aside from that, I've had a dramatic improvement in my psoriasis, which I had never gotten from any of the other diet evolutions that I had done before, except when I was either calorically restricted, dramatically calorically restricted. So during that, roughly a 40-year period, I tried some pretty extreme restrictive diets that were recommended for reversing psoriasis. And during those periods, I found that, and that's really how I got really hooked on plant-based diet, was that I would go on a very restricted plant-based diet. The first time I went on a vegan attempt, it was very low in energy, and I couldn't eat very much because the food is so bulky and I wasn't used to it eating that bulk of food, the volume. And so I lost a lot of weight, and during that period, I saw some improvement in my psoriasis. And at the time, I thought, oh, it's because I cut out animal products, right? Not realizing that just going into extreme caloric deficit and burning up my own body tissue and essentially being ketogenic as a result, because I'm burning up my own body fat and protein, that I was inducing an anti-inflammatory state that had nothing to do with the fact that I had cut out animal products. And in fact, I was living largely on animal protein and fat, my own.
Interesting.
I didn't realize that at the time, so I was, misled by the fact that I cut out animal products, that what I was putting in my mouth was just plants. So that's part of what convinced me that something had to do with these plants that was beneficial to me. And it wasn't until later that I finally figured that all out, what I just told you, which is that diet only benefited me when essentially it was calorically restricted enough for it to be essentially a ketogenic diet. But I did notice that when I ate sufficient volume of food and calories, that my skin, the improvements that I got, receded, and and I had increases in lesions. So I was then trying to sort through the plants. Which of the plants that I added back is wrong? That kind of thing. So it becomes a big puzzle, because without the key that I just explained to you. So when I finally discovered the key, which was that the ketosis what benefited me, and I went on the plant restricted diet, and and which was ketogenic and high in fat and low in protein, I saw the improvement in my skin condition that I had not seen before, except for those episodes I just described, or unless I had taken some medication. And then I had also some general skin quality improvements. Did I talk about the elbow already?
I don't think so.
Okay, so I had for as long as I could remember, I had rough skin on the back of my arms and especially on my elbows. I mean, I would describe them as feeling like sandpaper when I put my hands on them. It was always dry and rough. And within 3 months of adopting the ketogenic hypercarnivore diet, that was resolved. And it was a complete surprise to me because it had been something I'd had basically for my entire life, as far as I can remember. And go ahead.
No, go ahead.
And then for Tracy, whereas high fiber diet gave me gas, bloating, and loose stools, for Tracy, it gave her constipation with these enormous stools that she couldn't pass, basically. and that gradually resolved as we ate less minimized fiber, or ate very low fiber, very low plant content diet, so that her bowel started to normalize and she can have a regular bowel movement. And that was, again, something that she dealt with her entire life. She would eat. She always believed that fiber was the solution to her problem. So when she would not have bowel movement, she'd increase the fiber, take more psyllium husk or whatever. And then it would just build up, and she'd get this, what she would have called the kangaroo pouch in her lower abdomen.
Oh.
And then finally, some constellation of factors of water and whatever, it would just be so much pressure in the bottom of the intestine that it would finally come out, and it would be one of these sometimes a toilet stopper, and then, or just very large, which was surprising that it would even pass through the small opening. And then she would go through that whole cycle again, as if the fiber just built up in her intestines until it got so big that it could force its way through the anus.
I had a lot of other blood sugar.
And Tracy had a lot of blood sugar problems. That was her metabolic. She would get lightheaded and faint, and sometimes she would go, I just feel like I'm going to pass out, and she would come over to me, and I would literally have to hold her up because she would fall to the ground if I didn't. And that's the extreme manifestation of her, we call it blood sugar issues. And she would have a sense of can't focus at all, and fatigue and low moods. And so those things cleared up as she became adapted to fat. And now she can go, she couldn't go for a couple of hours without eating something. And I've noticed this with women. It was true of my first wife as well, that both my first wife and Tracy, they would eat these big plant-based meals, with the oatmeal, etc., greens and all of that stuff, nuts and seeds. And then a couple hours later, they would feel ravenous. And meanwhile, what would happen to me was I would eat that same meal and I would feel like I had eaten a brick. Like I couldn't bring myself to eat anything later because it was so heavy in my gut. So people obviously react differently to the very high fiber diets. In my case, it was more towards the diarrhea side, and for Tracy's and my first wife, this was the same. It was more towards the constipation as a side effect of that.
Yeah, it's amazing that you had such different symptoms, but they were a lot of them you both found relief from, lowering the fiber and adopting an animal-based diet.
Mm-hmm.
And Don, you've done a lot of extensive research, and I'm curious, from your work, are there any major downsides you see to the carnivore diet approach or hypercarnivore diet approach?
Well, the major downsides, I think, come from, dogma and rigidity, assuming that a muscle meat diet alone will satisfy all your nutritional needs or whatever. Having been in the vegan community and vegetarian community, I even at one point published some articles for Vegetarian Times and Vegetarian Resource Group way back. So I've been in that community, and I understand how they think, having been there. And I saw a lot of, as having been trained in philosophy and fallacies and so forth, and I saw a lot of poor quality, illogical thinking among vegans and promoters of plant-based diets. And I'm sorry to say I see the same thing happening among people who are adopting meat-based diets. Especially concerning to me is the idea meat is the perfect food. That, like some cut of meat, maybe ribeyes or ribs or chuck steak or whatever, that's perfect and you don't need anything else. And trotting out a few examples of people who've been on a diet for 10 or 15 or 20 years and saying, see, it worked for them, it will work for you. That's poor quality reasoning, to put it nicely, because there are outliers in every population. And for every one person who's gone 10, 15 or 20 years eating meat only, who manages to adapt to that, who's genetically capable of adapting to that, there may be 10 or 15 people who tried doing that and felt like crap after 3 months. So that's another reason why I opted for the hypercarnivore, plants optional, because for some people, plants may be beneficial. It may make it easier for them to adapt to the long term to a highly nutrient dense animal food based diet.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me, and I do see the same thing in the carnivore diet community. Folks making a lot of the same logical errors that it seems like vegan or plant-based advocates do, which is unfortunate. Don, one thing I'm curious about is you take such a deep and thorough approach to research in various topics that you dive into: diet, exercise, specific topics about micronutrients. How do you kind of pick topics? Do you just follow your curiosity or things pertaining to your own health? How do you go about sort of researching things?
So I usually get interested in a particular line of research, either because it's a topic that I'm dealing with. Like I did a lot of research on calcium because of an experience that I had with the hypercarnivore diet, where because so many people were saying meat only is, more healing than including dairy products or whatever, even though I had some very significant benefits and improvements in my condition while consuming a pint to a quart of yogurt or even milk daily, I got interested in experimenting to see if I would get even better results by cutting dairy products out. And every time I cut dairy products down or out, my the lesions that are most visible to observers, which were in my ears, would get much worse. And I was like, well, what is it in milk? I mean, obviously I'm getting plenty of protein from meat. I'm getting plenty of fat from meat as well. So I'm cutting something out when I get rid of milk that's affecting my condition. So I got interested from that in researching whether calcium had an impact on skin conditions. And it took me down a rabbit hole, discovery of a bunch of research showing that calcium deficiency is greater in dietary calcium deficiency is more common among psoriasis sufferers, and the role of calcium in skin cell proliferation and differentiation, going from immature skin cells to mature. In psoriasis, basically, people have skin cells that don't mature completely, and so they just slough off rather than becoming a normal skin matrix. So that's one way. Another way I get interested is I have people ask me questions, and I'm just a naturally curious person. So somebody says, I have this or that or the other thing happen, and I become curious and, well, why is that happening? So then I follow down that. Or I see something else, I see something happening, somebody claiming something, then I say, is that true? And then I end up, if I don't already know, then I end up following that down and learn as much as I can about that, to determine whether the person who's telling me whatever they're telling me is correct or not. For example, this also would relate to dairy products. The people from Paleomedicina, Hungary, claim that dairy products are adversely affect intestinal permeability. Well, that didn't mesh with my experience, so I decided to do a bunch of research, as much research as I could on that, read the literature, and I found that the literature points in the opposite direction, that there are a lot of components of dairy products that improve intestinal permeability. So that's how I learned about that. Sometimes I'm just curious. I keep periodic track of what I'm consuming, and I see fluctuations in my nutrient intake, so I might be interested in what role particular nutrient might be playing in my condition or other conditions. So those are some of the main ways I get stimulated for learning.
Yeah, that's great. And I would love to just segue into the dairy and milk topic. Do you think most folks on the hypercarnivore diet would benefit from including some dairy and milk, and why is that?
Well, I hesitate to say most. So I try to put my information out there as this has worked for me, and I have a reasonable suspicion that people who have an ancestral history of consuming dairy products. In other words, your ancestors were used dairy products substantially in their diet,
right?
May benefit. So that would apply to most Europeans, and pockets of people from around the world. However, as I discuss in the book, there's also, there's current scientific evidence that the Japanese are benefiting to some extent from including dairy products in their diet, even though they don't have an ancestral history. So my caution is that there's probably a genetic component that may make some people capable of benefiting more from inclusion of dairy products than others. But there's also this slop factor, as I noted in the book, where if you do a little bit of research, you can find out that there are people from all races who are living pastoral lives, like Mongols or Asian. The Maasai are African. There's can't remember the name of the group of Chinese who live in the western mountains of China who consume a lot of dairy products, the Tibetans. So it's not in the Indians on the Indian subcontinent. So it's not clear that even for those people, dairy products might not be beneficial if they can, find a form that they can tolerate in terms of lactose digestion, which, according to the research I've read, only requires that it be turned into a soured milk product like kefir or yogurt or that type of thing.
Yeah,
that's like an open question to me. I don't say everyone should eat dairy products, but I think it's worth people experimenting. And the reason is that dairy products provide, because they're in nature, they're designed by nature to provide all the nutrients that a infant needs. They're very high nutrient density, regardless of feeding strategy, because nature is, set up so that even if the mother is not getting all the nutrients she needs, the teats or breasts are going to take the milk or are going to take from the mother's body and put it into milk what the offspring needs. So for me, nutritionally, if I cut dairy products out, then I got to cover a lot of bases with something else that dairy products cover very easily in a very palatable way.
Yeah. That's interesting. And a lot of people emphasize raw dairy, unhomogenized dairy. Do you think that's important, or what if folks only have access to kind of food at their local grocery store? Is it still safe to test dairy in those forms?
Well, that's what I drink. I drink pasteurized, homogenized milk from my local supermarket. And my rationale is that I haven't seen any evidence that that the milk from grass-fed or raw milk is 3 to 4 times more nutritious than pasteurized, homogenized milk. Nor am I convinced that there's good evidence that pasteurization or homogenization does any significant damage to the nutrient content of milk. And funny you should ask this, because I actually had a guy ask me on Instagram just today or yesterday. He asked me if I drank raw milk, and I said no, pasteurized. And he said, why is that? And I'm explaining to him what I'm saying right now. And he's asked me the same question of whether grass-fed and unpasteurized, unhomogenized is more nutritious. And I said, well, to me, it's not worth whatever difference there is, which may be 5%, something like that, isn't worth paying 3 to 4 times as much for. That's my approach. And in addition, he said he had been drinking raw milk up until about 2 weeks ago, but he got food poisoning from it, which put him onto pasteurized milk for the last couple of weeks.
Oh.
And so I said, well, that's one of the reasons I chose also to drink pasteurized milk, because I buy milk in markets. I don't raise the cattle myself. If I was raising the cattle myself and I could be assured that the raw milk was as clean as possible because I was doing it, or I had a local farmer who I trusted the utmost, I could still get the milk for a reasonable cost, then I might select to do that. Although I'm still concerned about the transmission of disease through that, because it's just the milk is at the teats are near the rear end of the cow. It's just, there's a lot of room for error there.
Right. Yeah.
That's
a good point.
That's why contamination can take place, and it can be seriously damaging to people's health. So my advice, or my choice, is to use pasteurized, in part because I am not interested in getting food poisoning. And the CDC I'm not a big believer in government regulation and that type of thing at all, but statistically, there is a much higher risk of getting a bacterial infection from raw milk than pasteurized, and it stands to reason.
Yeah.
And the last thing that I mentioned to this fellow, and I'll say here, is that I've put on my Instagram as well posts from scientific articles and books that have reported, as well as a video that of the Mongols showing that they cook the milk. They don't eat only raw milk. I feel like there's a kind of a myth that before the 20th century, everybody only ate raw milk before the invention of pasteurization, but that doesn't appear to be the case. Heat was used to process milk by the Maasai. Heat was used to process milk by the Mongols. It's one of the ways that they get efficient curding. You let the milk sour a little bit, and then you heat it. It will easily separate. You get curds, and then you can make your cheeses and stuff out of it. So
yeah, That's really interesting, and I love how you're not afraid to have a different view on sort of the standard carnivore or keto viewpoint of, you have to have grass finished meat, you have to have raw dairy. I love how you go and do your own research and take a skeptical viewpoint against some of these topics. And another thing, just while we're on the concept of raw, is I know lately I've seen you include some raw meat in your diet. Where do you stand on kind of the value of raw versus cooked meat? Does it have greater bioavailability of nutrients? Are you worried about getting food poisoning from it, to your point? How do you feel about that?
Okay, so both raw and cooked have pros and cons. So raw, the advantage is that you have a higher nutrient quantity because some of the B vitamins are susceptible to heat, and when you cook, you also can lose juices, and there you're losing some minerals. So you end up with may end up with less nutrients in the cooked product. So in that case, that's where raw has the advantage. On the other hand, raw has the potential risk of infection, and in terms of bioavailability, they're pretty much the same. So in terms of infection with raw meat, you can mitigate, reduce the risk by consuming meat that's been previously frozen for sufficient duration, which is the way I mostly consume liver raw because that's the way I prefer it. I don't like cooked liver very much, but I like raw liver. So I consume that raw, but I purchase liver that's been previously frozen, usually get from my supermarket, either Sprouts or Albertsons, Skylark brand, and then so the freezing destroys the pathogens, if there are any.
Got it.
And sometimes, on occasion, I have eaten just raw meat that I bought at this. Again, people won't. I like to test these things. Is it really harmful to me too? So I'm not just opposed ideologically. I like to know whether it actually has an effect. So I have eaten meat from the counter where you buy it in a cellophane wrap, right? I don't go out of my way to find out or to get some special meat to eat raw necessarily. And I've eaten that without any problem, raw, a few times. So and I noticed that, the butchers at the markets that I frequent, they wear white coats, they wear rubber gloves. I think they're keeping a very high standard of sanitation. So I'm a little more confident that the meat is safer to eat raw than milk, just because the milk is, as I said, gathered from the end of the animal where there's a high potential of getting contaminated from some other orifice that you don't want. Whereas meat is rather carefully washed and all of that when it's being butchered. So I haven't had any problem eating either that so far, and I'm not recommending this to anybody, but so far I haven't had any problem eating raw meat from the regular meat counter on occasion. And I actually found that I only attempted that recently because I found the local Albertsons had London broil on sale for like $1.99 or something like that. And so I bought a big chunk of it, but I don't like London broil cooked. So when I bought it, I thought, well, maybe I'll just try eating it raw because I might have the same experience I have with liver, that I just like it better raw.
Yeah.
So I chopped it up finely and I mixed it with a little garlic salt and some olive oil, and I haven't had any problem with it so far. Other than that, previously when I ate raw, I would buy when I was paleo, I would buy frozen grass-fed ground beef The main issue with ground beef is that in a commercial source, sometimes they're mixing meat from multiple animals. So you don't know for sure if you get sick, which animal did it come from? You can't trace it because there's too much mixture. So if I bought ground beef that I was intending to eat raw, I preferred to get frozen from a small producer who could guarantee me that this came from only one animal.
Yeah, that makes sense. And just to be clear for folks, you still eat most of your food cooked, correct?
Most of my meat I eat cooked, but quite rare. Pretty bloody or sometimes purple.
Yeah.
Hardly seared. But yeah, I think with the contamination, ground meat introduces the most potential contamination because they're going to put it through a grinder. Who knows how well if somebody just per chance didn't clean that grinder well enough after the last use, there might be some bacteria in there and you might get sick. But when you buy a big, just a slice of meat like a steak or a roast or whatever, if you clean the outside or sear the outside, there's unlikely to be bacteria on the inside that can harm you.
Right. That makes sense. And Don, what I'd love to do is just have you go through kind of an average day of eating for you, and you can explain why you include some of the things you do, whether it's organ or possibly eggshells or dairy for the calcium. I know recently I've seen you posting pictures with bone broth or sometimes adding glycine or collagen to your drinks, and also sometimes having fish oil. So I would love to have you go through just kind of like an average day of eating, how you think about nutrition, and then how you think about why you're including some of those things.
Okay. So up until recently, I'm doing an experiment. So for about the last 12 months, I've been doing a very high meat intake, about 1 to 2 pounds of meat per day. In addition to having eggs, sometimes bacon, not every day having bacon. And then I had my dairy products in addition, which I'll get into detail in a moment. And I did that because I was testing, and the whole idea that your diet should be really high in meat for the micronutrients or whatever the meat is providing for you, and that somehow the extra protein would be beneficial maybe for lean mass gain, et cetera. And none of that was realized for me. It didn't have any really discernible negative impact on my psoriasis, but my progress in my psoriasis was basically kind of stagnant for the last 8 months for the lesions that are remaining, which are mostly on my scalp. The lesions on my ears and limbs have pretty much completely resolved, and they've remained stable. So since the weekend, I had a conversation with, I don't know if you know Borj Fajerli.
Yep, Borja.
Yeah, Borja. So we had a conversation in the Hypercarnivore Diet group on Facebook. That's my Facebook group for the Hypercarnivore Diet. And he was pointing me towards some resources that were suggesting a higher fat to protein ratio may be beneficial, including the Paleomedicina approach, which is 2-to-1 fat to protein, which is more like what I did during the first 6 to 8 months of my hypercarnivore journey, starting in mid 2017. And during that time, I reached my lowest body fat and waist girth level in my entire adult life since I passed the age of 20. And during the year that I ate higher protein, my waist girth kind of gradually crept up from the low of 30.5 inches to back to 32.5. And the other thing that I noticed was I don't religiously, but periodically, you could say maybe a once or twice a week, I'll test my fasting blood sugar and ketones. And my ketones were always basically nearly undetectable or up to 0.3, which is not much ketones. And my blood sugar was usually on the high end of normal, like in 100, 101, something like that, which was starting to concern me because one of the problems that's associated with psoriasis is insulin resistance and high hyperglycemia, having a high blood sugar. Research shows that people who have psoriasis tend to be manifesting these features of metabolic syndrome. So when my waist is expanding, that's going in the direction of metabolic syndrome. Blood sugar is getting elevated. That's, again, more like metabolic syndrome. So I wasn't wanting to go any further with that. And the conversation we had on the Hypercarnivore Diet Facebook group convinced me that I should kind of reverse and go back to eating more fat, and rather than what was more like a 1-to-1 fat to protein ratio, I'm aiming for 1.5 to 2 times as much fat as protein by weight. So 2 grams of fat for every gram of protein would be the optimum.
And how are you doing that? What sources are you getting the fat from?
So here's a typical day. I'm eating first of all, rather than eat a lot of red meat like I was, I'm eating less red meat, but more eggs. So more like 4 to 6 eggs in a day rather than I was eating about 3 eggs a day and a bigger volume of red meat. Now more like 4 to 6 eggs a day. And I'm choosing that because I'm reducing the volume of meat and I want to maintain the nutrient density. So egg yolks are very high nutrient density. And some of the things that are in shortage in red meat are much better provided by egg yolks, like folic acid, vitamin E, choline. What else? I think those come to mind right away as the key nutrients. They're kind of poorly supplied by muscle meat, but very well supplied by egg yolks. And then my red meat portion, and I prefer beef. I don't, every now and then I eat pork, but I'm not a big fan of pork. Maybe I'm not good at preparing it ideally, because when I go out and have pork ribs prepared in a restaurant or something, I like it. But when I prepare ribs myself or pork dishes myself, I'm generally not impressed with the result. I prefer beef. So mostly I eat red meat pretty much every day, and now it'll be up to 250 grams per day. So somewhere between 150 and 250 grams per day. And that will be the bulk of my protein. Then I do like to consume 1 or 2 ounces of liver daily or every other day. If I do it every other day, more like 2 ounces, and if I'm doing it every day, 1 ounce. And as I said earlier, I'll eat that raw, and I sometimes just eat it directly, or I'll put a little bit of seasoning on it. I like natural ketchup and horseradish, like a cocktail sauce on it. But I'll sometimes, as I said, eat it raw. I mean, just straight with nothing on it. And I do that because that's the way I prefer to eat liver, and also that's the best way to. Liver is high, one animal product that's pretty high in vitamin C, so I want to preserve that vitamin C. Even though research shows that cooking liver has very little effect on the vitamin C content, which is kind of interesting. Cooking plants usually destroys a significant portion of the vitamin C, but according to USDA data, cooking liver has very little impact on the vitamin C content of liver. Why that is, I don't think anybody knows. but I have a hypothesis, and that is that there's a form of vitamin C that's called ascorbyl palmitate, which is a fat-soluble form of vitamin C, and my suspicion is that's what's in liver, and that it's more heat-stable than the water-soluble ascorbic acid, which is what you find in plants. So let's see, go from there. Then I started incorporating bacon more frequently because bacon is a fairly good source of thiamine. Plus, it's delicious with eggs. And beef has less thiamine per 100 grams than pork does. So I don't like most forms of pork, as I said, but bacon I get along with, and I'll also use pork sausages for the same purpose. And with what I'm doing now, with looking for a higher fat to protein ratio, I will use more sausages because a properly prepared sausage usually has 2 or 3 times as much fat as protein, whereas like a ribeye is 1-to-1 protein.
Right.
Fat. And that's one of the ways, by the way, our ancestors made use of all the extra fat that when you kill an animal, there's a lot of visceral fat, there's adipose fat, all of that. One of the ways they used that for food was to put it in sausages. Use blood sausage or whatever, you put some fat in there with it, some of that fat that's just part of the carcass. So that's part of eating nose to tail, which I don't, as again, an aside, I don't see nose to tail people emphasizing that you need to be eating all the fat, or at least mimicking eating all of that fat when you eat nose to tail. It's not just about eating organs. It's also about eating marrow and adipose fat and all of that. Then, let's see, I covered the meat and the eggs and the dairy products. So because I have found through experiments, as I mentioned earlier, that I do best with 1 pint to a quart of milk or yogurt daily. Usually I consume it as yogurt. I will consume that. I'll have 1 to 2 cups, which is a pint, or up to 4 cups of yogurt or milk per day. Usually I have the higher amount on a day that I train and the lesser amount on a day that I don't train. And so that additional dairy product on a day I train just provides the additional calories to cover my additional energy expenditure. And as I said, I usually consume that as yogurt. And the main reasons nutritionally that I would consume those is, one, I've found that my skin improves the best when I am consuming at least 1,000 milligrams of calcium per day, and dairy products are providing around those milk or yogurt around 250 to 300 milligrams per cup. And also dairy products are actually good sources of omega-3 fatty acids. So when I leave the dairy products out of my diet, the omega-3 content of the diet goes down, even though if you eat enough meat in a high enough quantity, you'll get omega-3s, but through trial and running nutrition analysis of what I eat, I noticed that it's much easier to get a higher amount of omega-3 when I use dairy products. So that's the dairy products. And then if my calcium content is, say, less than 1,500 milligrams per day, which is what I prefer, then I'll add in a half a teaspoon or teaspoon of eggshell powder. The eggshell powder is about 800 milligrams of calcium per teaspoon. So I'll just titrate that based on what I'm eating in terms of dairy products. And then I sometimes include, sometimes don't include cod liver oil. As I wrote in the book, I haven't really people make a big deal about omega-3 fatty acids and needing to eat fish, but I personally haven't noticed any positive or negative effects from including fish oil, and I usually use cod liver oil. And as I mentioned in a book, I think cod liver oil is a very cost-effective way to supplement omega-3s because you also get vitamin D and vitamin A with that. So especially if you're not a liver eater, and muscle meat has very low vitamin A content, a teaspoon or two of cod liver oil can provide you with adequate vitamin A, as well as provide you with the omega-3s. So, but like I said, that's kind of, it's not something that I'm religious about because I haven't noticed a benefit nor a detriment. And that doesn't mean there isn't one. It's just something I haven't been able to notice, right? That's one of the That's the problems with your own perception. I try to stay aware that just because I don't notice something doesn't mean that there's nothing happening. Sometimes the change can be so subtle that you can't really identify it.
I respect that intellectual honesty. And one other thing, Don, was the collagen or glycine supplementation, or in addition, bone broth. How do you think about that? And are you a proponent of the kind of glycine to methionine ratios?
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks for reminding me to get back to that. So I only recently started experimenting with adding a Great Lakes brand hydrolyzed collagen, and I openly just admit it's an experiment. I can't endorse or condemn or anything collagen. I'm just trying to see if it improves my condition at all in any way, if I can notice anything. Aside from that, I have read a few studies, and it does look like mammals are more efficient at metabolizing methionine without side effects if they have a higher glycine to methionine ratio. And it looks like the ideal ratio should be like 2.5 or more parts glycine to methionine. So I'll have to get back to you more on that right now because I'm going through this transition. When I was eating 1 to 2 pounds of meat per day, it's much harder to get that high of a glycine to methionine ratio because when you eat 1 to 2 pounds of meat, you're getting a heck of a lot of methionine. And then you'd have, I think I figured I would have to eat like 4 to 6 tablespoons of that collagen hydrolysate to get the recommended ratio, even though there is some significant amount of glycine in meat already. But now that I'm eating a smaller portion of red meat, I haven't done it. It's like I only made this transition again and started monitoring what happens nutritionally when I do that over this past weekend. So I'm not clear whether it's even necessary now because of the lower amount of methionine I'm consuming. Nevertheless, I have, consumed 1 or 2 tablespoons of that collagen per day. In terms of bone broth, I have included that it's an additional source of calcium. You do get the glycine. I don't know how much because I make homemade. The amount of collagen in it varies from batch to batch that we make, obviously, because some of it is more gelled and some is less gelled. And you also get some other trace minerals. So I think it's a good idea to consume some bone broth. I don't do it every single day. I think if you consume dairy products, it's less necessary to consume bone broth. But if you don't consume dairy products, I think bone broth is like your non-dairy milk. There you're going to get your calcium, the that stuff. You're going to get some glycine, which is protein, like that's in milk also. You're going to get some fat if you've used some bones that have some fat on it. So it's kind of like bone broth is the non-dairy milk, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Interesting.
Thanks. Sorry.
Go ahead.
The other things you asked about is fat. So where I'm getting most, I'm at this point in time, I believe myself from experiments to be quite tolerant and benefiting from dairy products. So I'm getting a lot of my fat currently from cream. Cream has very little protein or carbohydrate in it. It's essentially pure fat, and it's easy for me to consume. I'll put it in my tea, and I do consume black tea most days for multiple reasons. One, there's good evidence, or there's suggestive evidence, I'll say, that it plays a role in the longevity of tea drinking populations. It provides manganese, which is a mineral that's in shortage from animal-based diet as far as I can tell. Haven't found the animal product that is high in manganese. The only other plant product that's really high in manganese that I'm aware of, there may be something I'm not aware of, is nuts, but I don't tolerate nuts very well. And they give me digestive problems. But tea I have no problem with. And tea also provides a small amount of folate, which again, you're getting that from liver. If you don't eat liver, tea is another way you can get it. Egg yolks also provide folate. I think I mentioned that. And then butter, and occasionally I have some olive oil as well. And since I'm a hypercarnivore, I don't shy away from sometimes having plants, mushrooms, and mostly we eat low sugar fruit type vegetables like cucumber, zucchini, summer squash, mushrooms, which aren't really technically a plant, they're fungi, and occasional fruits, berries, small amounts of maybe apricots or something like that. Sometimes I have oranges when they're in season here. I haven't noticed any negative effect from including small amounts of plants, which rarely the plant component of my diet exceeds 10% in terms of calories.
Yeah, that's really helpful and interesting, Don. Thanks for going through that. And shifting topics a little bit, would love to hear your thoughts on fasting. Or actually, before we get to that, one thing I didn't ask is you've posted recently that you have some particular thoughts about sodium to potassium ratios in carnivores. Curious to hear how you think about that.
Okay, so yeah, this is a good opportunity to go in a little more depth on that, because since I posted that, it was in response to a post that Paul Saladino had posted that I was a little bit concerned about carnivores getting a little too salt happy, because meat has about a 4-to-1 potassium to sodium ratio. Milk is about 5-to-1. And there's some research that suggests, well, that's the normal ratio of potassium to sodium in a mammal. So a lot of people have used sodium, salt, to make the meat more palatable to consume because they're trying to eat large amounts of it. And secondly, to address cramping, muscle cramping, because sodium deficiency causes muscle cramping. When you eat low carbohydrate, your insulin level goes down. You don't retain sodium as efficiently. You also lose potassium because you urinate a little bit more, and that can cause muscle cramping. But one thing that I noticed was, and this is a combination of things, and I'm not sure, I'm still sorting it out, but I think I have a good idea. So eating a very high protein diet, the larger amount of meat I was eating, that favors a little bit higher insulin ratio than eating a lower protein diet, because you need insulin to metabolize protein. especially protein that's high in essential amino acids like animal protein. So I think it's the interaction that affected me. It's the interaction between eating high protein, which probably raised my insulin level exposure a little bit or significantly compared to eating a 50% to 100% lower protein, and the sodium, because that would higher insulin favors the sodium retention. So I was getting some problem with water retention, and I knew that it came after I ate large amounts of sodium, and I thought it was just a temporary thing. But as I went on and I was following this practice of using larger amounts of sodium, which I kind of learned from D. Nicola Antonio, I noticed that it was becoming chronic. I was starting to have, in the morning, my feet would be okay, but at the end of the day, they looked, abnormally swollen. Not just I've been on my feet all day kind of swollen, but that doesn't look right. And so I started manipulating the sodium and content of my diet, and of course confirmed that it was the sodium that I was eating that was causing this additional water retention. So that made me a little bit concerned about this, the coincidence of these ideas that we should eat very high protein and also eat a lot of sodium, or, significant sodium. And I don't believe that, our Paleolithic ancestors had the access to sodium that we're talking about now. They got sodium from, for example, just eating blood, which we're not allowed to eat. I mean, you can't go to the supermarket and buy the blood from the cow. So I'm concerned that people may be getting too high of a sodium to potassium ratio, and there's some evidence that this can have adverse effects in other ways, that it can affect your susceptibility to allergies, that it make your immune system more susceptible to autoimmune reactions. There's not all the research on salt is positive. So I'm a little concerned about that. And so I, in order to kind of rectify that a little bit for myself recently, I started using the Morton's salts alternative, which is potassium chloride instead of sodium chloride. And that seems to be helping me a little bit. It's a experimental stage again for me.
Yeah, really interesting, and I'm definitely intrigued. I've been personally adding a lot of potassium and sodium to my diet, just as an experiment, having electrolyte packets and just teaspoons of Redmond real salt, and washing it down with the new salt as well, which is just pure potassium. And I felt a lot better having that a few times a day, especially before bed. It helps me stay asleep at night and not have to wake up to go to the bathroom. And I also have it before training. But you make some really interesting arguments about the ratios, especially in the context of a carnivore diet.
My issue was, that's the one thing that I have, I'll say, a complaint about with the carnivore low carbohydrate, high fat diet, is that I'm prone to the muscle cramps at night. Like, I don't have a problem during the day, but at night, especially, it seems like between the 2 and 5 a.m. Window, I will get cramps in my feet. Not every night. And what I did for them previously was I would just get up and drink water with salt in it, because, well, muscle cramping can be due to salt deficiency. But then recently I just started getting up and just drinking. First I would check in with myself and say, okay, do I really want salt? And oftentimes I found, no, I don't want salt. I'm just thirsty. So I would just drink water. And I found that sometimes just drinking water solved the problem. So it may be that in some cases your cramps are just your blood volume has declined, and you're not getting sufficient blood volume to those extremities when you're lying down, because when you're standing up, of course, gravity is helping bring the blood to the feet and calves. But when you lay down, especially most people's mattress, I looked at my mattress too to try to determine, is this some kind of mechanical problem as well? And I noticed that because my mattress is a little bit worn, it's actually higher at the end where my feet are than it is where my torso is. So my feet are actually a little bit elevated, which is contributing to there's not enough blood in my feet, right?
Huh.
So it's like having my feet propped up for too long, and the blood flow is not as at night when your heart rate is low and your heart's not pumping hard. You may not be delivering enough of that blood to your feet, given the gravity effect. So in my case, I believe that's part of. I was actually this morning thinking I'm going to try an experiment where I sleep on the floor because the floor is hard. My feet cannot be higher than my torso, and see if that solves my problem.
Yeah, good luck. Good luck with that. I feel like there's always something disturbing our sleep, and it's a constant battle.
Yeah.
Don, one thing I wanted to get your take on as well is fasting and fasted training. I know.
You still there?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah.
Hi,
I
Don.
got you there. Can you hear me?
One thing I wanted to get your take on was fasting and fasted training. I know you often train fasted, or at least last time I checked. What is your perspective on one, 24-hour fast or more, and two, fasted training if your goal is to build muscle? So
I'll start with the second one first. Fasted training, I love it. It was before I was convinced that I wasn't going to have poor performance because I hadn't eaten anything before training. I would eat something before training, and first of all, it made it hard for me to schedule training in the day because it meant I had to train after I had eaten. Well, after I've eaten, I'm usually going off to work, or if it's later in the day, things interfere with my training. So it was a hassle for me in that regard. And but once I was convinced, and this is years ago now, that it wasn't going to have a negative effect on my training or performance to train in a fasted state, I haven't turned back. I do not eat before I train. I prefer, and I feel my performance is actually better when my blood supply can go only for my muscles rather than having to deal with some food in my stomach. Of course, it depends on how much you eat, but in regards to that, how much difference is it going to make if you eat 100 calories or whatever of food? You have complex reactions, like you're going to get an insulin reaction. Is that actually ideal in the pre-training state? You don't want a high insulin. You don't want a storage mode. You don't want the rest and digest aspect of your nervous system, the parasympathetic, to be activated. You want to be fight or flight when you're training. Well, that's more when you're hungry. You're going to have more sympathetic nervous system activity. So I love training fasted, and I don't like training with a full stomach for sure, or even anything in my stomach. I prefer it to be completely empty. I just feel like I can concentrate more, and my functionality is better. In terms of the 24-hour fast, I do that myself spontaneously on an irregular basis, based on how I feel. So I would say it's roughly once every 4 to 8 weeks, I just get to a point where I don't feel like eating. And I don't. I will not eat for 24 or 36 hours, whatever it takes to where I feel ready to eat again. And but I don't plan anything specifically, like a once a week fast or something like that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I trained fasted for a long time, and most recently I've been training sort of in the middle of the day, and that's felt really good for me to have some food in my stomach. But I definitely preferred training fasted early in the morning to something like trying to slam down a protein shake or trying to eat a small meal. I agree with you that it's just kind of a distraction. Feels like all your blood is in your gut.
Mhm.
And so I'd love to shift topics a little bit, Don, to exercise. Why do you exercise with bands and body weight, and what's your current exercise regime look like?
Okay, well, I've been resistance training since I was in high school, and of course I started out with barbells, and then I graduated to Nautilus machines, and then I went back to barbells. So why do I do it? Well, because first of all, I've experimented with the high-tech machines. It's the best that was available at the time that I've used them. Hammer, Nautilus, whatever. I've never used Matesz, but I doubt that the result would be any different. I did not notice any discernible difference in results, whether I used a barbell or body weight or an expensive machine. And when I got my first home gym, it's what I still have, except for I don't no longer have the Olympic barbell. I just love the freedom of being able to train at home, because I don't have to wait in line for machines. I don't have to wait in line for the barbell. I don't have to drive anywhere to get to my training session. It cuts commute time out of my workout time. And in terms of why do I use the elastic bands? Well, as I said, I had an Olympic barbell set, and I had been using that for years. And due to multiple injuries I've had in the past, I had injuries during practicing martial arts. I had injuries doing foolish things, lumbar injuries repeatedly. Once I had my first major lumbar injury, it became easier to cause another one to occur. I became much more conservative than when I was young in terms of what I would want to do for training. I became concerned about the safety as well as the efficacy. And starting about a year ago, I started investigating bands as an alternative to using your isoinertial, barbell plates. And I had already been using body elastic bands off and on for a few things like leg curls and tricep extensions and so forth. But I became interested in the idea of using bands to train the major muscle groups, especially the hips and thighs. And I hadn't found a way to really do that very efficiently. I was toying around with different ways of using the body elastic bands, attaching them to my power rack and so forth. And I started to find some methods that worked, especially when you do a unilateral type, like a split squat or a single leg squat. And let's see, it would be about 4 or 5 years ago, I became interested in doing body weight training, partly because I had always wanted to master handstand, and I never had the instruction guidance needed to do that. And partly because I thought, wow, that's kind of cool, the front lever. I would like to do that. It's just seeing some of the body weight feats that can be performed. I thought I would be interested in doing that kind of training just for the cool factor, right? And so I took the Gymnastics Bodies Foundation 1 course and their handstand 1, which I'm still working on. And I have a chronic injury in my left shoulder, and I thought if I do these because of all of the mobility work that's included in this gymnastics bodies program that Coach Sommer recommends, maybe I'll get past this shoulder injury I have and rectify some of the hip and lower back issues that I have, and become just a stronger in those places where I developed weaknesses because of injuries. So that's how I got started into body weight training. And so I've been doing that for, I think it's 5 or 6 years now. I'd have to look at my training records to see when I really started. And for me, it's been quite a journey. And indeed, it has helped a lot to do this mobility intensive training in addition to my high intensity strength training to improve my hip and lower back mobility and stability and my shoulder. And I'm actually getting quite close to a resolution of some of these problems that I have had been dealing with for quite a long time. I can't remember when it was that I've first had these. I know I injured my shoulder when I was like 12 or 13, and it's been bothering me to some extent ever since then. And then about a year and a half ago or a year ago, I don't remember exactly, but it's somewhere in that range, I became aware of this device called the X3 bar and saw Dr. Jockweisz performing squats and deadlifts with an elastic band, and I was like, that's what I've been looking for, a way to use elastic bands to do these major lower body exercises. So then I did a considerable amount of research on elastic bands for pretty much six to 8 months or no. In other words, I didn't want to buy an elastic band device without knowing whether it was going to provide me with the equivalent type of stimulus for my muscles. And I came to the conclusion after reading quite a few scientific articles that there's no real difference between using elastic resistance and isoinertial resistance. There might even be an advantage for elastic resistance. I don't know that it's quite to the degree that it's implied by Dr. Jockweisz, but there is the advantage that it is variable, which is it's more aligned with the actual strength curve of squatting and pressing exercises and the deadlift, where your strength gets greater as the joints extend. But it's the opposite of the ideal for pulling exercises like chin-ups and rowing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm a huge fan of bodyweight exercise as well. And are you doing all your exercises to failure? I know you practice something similar to a high intensity approach.
So yeah, I've been an advocate or a user, I guess you say, a user of high intensity training, one set to failure for most of my training career since I was in high school. Because when I started doing one set to failure training in high school, I had a dramatic improvement in results compared to what I had been getting from multiple set training routines. And over the years, I've dabbled a bit with some still what I would class as high intensity training, but it's not to failure. Like starting strength, you're still using limited sets, limited exercises, and training not to failure, but you're training in a high intensity range, I'll say.
Right.
And I found that productive as well, but it's far more time consuming than single set training. So yes, I train to failure, but not when I was young, and I got the idea that in order to replicate a multiple set routine with a single set to failure. You had to do this to kind of crucify your muscles with forced repetitions and drop sets and all of that. But I learned over time that that's not the case. That muscle growth is a threshold phenomenon. All you have to do is provide a stimulus that surpasses the threshold that triggers a process to take place. And that threshold actually probably, from what I've read recently, it probably comes before you get to the last repetition where you can't perform another repetition, in other words, complete concentric failure. It may come like 2 or 3 repetitions before then. There have been some studies looking at muscle activation during exercise, and it looks like everything is firing at that basically maximum level within the last 3 to 4 repetitions. So for that reason, I'm far more conservative than I was in the past. In other words, I don't do what I said, the attempt to crucify or destroy my muscles, just stimulate. And I found that very productive. And the more important thing, which Arthur Jones talked about a lot, which the high intensity community is very well aware of, is that once you've accomplished that stimulus, now the thing that is going to occur is in a black box. It's your body's going to take that stimulus and turn it into an adaptation, and that occurs during the recovery period. And it's the manipulation of the recovery period that becomes important, especially as you age. I'm nearly 60 years old now. So, up until recently, I was training 3 days a week, full body 3 days a week. But once I surpassed about 156 pounds, I had gained from my, regained the muscle mass that I lost during my vegan years. When I reached that roughly 155, 156, I continued to train 3 times a week, hoping that I would continue to add lean mass, but my strength basically plateaued. And for quite a long time, and I tried manipulating other variables like the type of exercise. Would I do a negative accentuated type exercise, or change the order of exercises or change the exercises, which is usually not a good idea because you just go through a motor adaptation phase, which can trick you into thinking that you've restarted gains when all you're doing is actually just accommodating to a motor pattern. But it wasn't productive. None of that was productive, and my better understanding knew that wasn't going to work. That it comes down to I had reached a plateau because I was able in a single session to do more work than I could recover from productively. I could recover from it, in other words, replicate the effort in the next session, but I couldn't improve on it because I wasn't allowing my body enough time to recover, and I was taking too much energy in a session from my body due to the amount of work I was doing. So I had to reduce my volume and frequency.
Yeah. And do you think in general, Don, for folks, how would you say your advice is to handle stalls with a low volume and frequency approach? Is it to...
Still there?
Yep. Hi, Don, can you hear me? Hello?
Now I hear you.
Hello?
I hear you now. Can you hear me?
Sorry, the question was, Don, how to handle stalls with a low volume and frequency approach. It sounds like you're advocating, in general, more rest rather than increasing the stress part of the equation.
Yeah, so Arthur Jones was I don't know if he was the first to point this out, but he's the first person I'm aware of to point this out. And so you have two options. You can reduce the volume per training session, and you can reduce the frequency of the training sessions. And sometimes you may need to do both. So it kind of depends on what you're feeling. So what was going on for me when I was doing full body was that it was taking 1 to 2 hours to complete the session when I included my mobility training. And if I was paying close attention, about halfway through, I could feel that the next half of this is going to be just completed by force of will. You know, the energy isn't really there, but I'll be able to do it. That is, you know, an indicator that you need to cut the volume of the exercise session in half. So you can do that. My preference is to cut it into a lower and upper body session. You could also split it as a push and pull, but I'm not a big fan of that because push and pull would mean for most people you do squats one day and deadlifts the other day. And that way you end up working the hips and lower back every day. If you do split the upper body and lower body, you're giving your lower back and your hips a longer rest period. And those are the most productive, you know, those exercises are the most productive in the long run. So you want your performance on those to be as good as possible. So I find that best. That's what I would suggest, is that if you're in a plateau and you're doing a full body routine, split it into a half upper and a lower routine and avoid overlap as much as possible. And instead of doing full body 3 times a week, do upper one day, lower the next day, upper one day, you know, alternate upper and lower. Then if that doesn't restart progress, then you can increase the rest period between sessions. So go Monday, instead of Monday, Wednesday, Friday, maybe do Monday, Thursday, Sunday, something like that. Add an extra rest day.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great advice.
Another option to initially try, I should say this, because this can work as well. You go from 3 full bodies per week, cut the volume down. So maybe you had 12 or 14 sets before, cut it down to more like 8 or 9 sets, and then do just 2 per week. So you were doing Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, do only Monday and Friday. And then maybe put your mobility or something else on Wednesday that's just a general activity that's not highly intense training.
And in general, Don, are you doing 1 set per exercise?
Yeah, I do 1 set per exercise. I do a general full body warm up, and then I do 1 set per exercise. All are carried to concentric failure with the current routine that I have with the elastic bands and whatever. But if I was using barbells, say I was doing deadlifts and squats, I would not go to concentric failure. I would do what I'll call AMRAP, as many reps as possible. When you get to the rep where you know you're not going to be able to, if you've got experience, you should be able to know, if I try the next one, I'm not going to get it. You stop before you try the next one. You try that one, because those exercises are too hazardous to go to failure. Even if you have a safety rack or whatever, the best thing is to be safe rather than sorry, because at this point it's pretty clear that the actual threshold is probably passed by the 2 or 3 reps before failure. You'll be fine, and just stop a little bit short of failure and save it for the next time.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Definitely want to be safe on those big barbell exercises. And another question was on training. Do you believe there's any difference in training for longevity/health versus muscle? And how would you make that distinction in the type of training you do, or how you would tweak it for either of those goals?
So I don't think there's really a distinction. Longevity. Can you hang on for a second? Scott?
Yep, sure.
Yeah, I just gotta talk to my wife for just a second.
Yeah, no problem.
You got an appointment?
Yeah, Kathleen and Paul are going to be there.
I've got one at 4:30, so I'll be there ASAP.
I'll just tell them you'll be late. Your food's all, you got to just measure the meat and pack it to go.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Sorry for that.
No problem.
I'm sure that can be edited.
We'll get wrapped up.
Yeah. So I don't really think there's any difference. To me, what is a feature of longevity? It's your body is declining in function. And part of that decline in function is that you're losing muscle mass and strength. So if you're gaining muscle mass, or at least stalling loss of muscle mass, and you're either gaining strength or at least stalling the loss of strength, then you're training for longevity. And so the ideal training program for longevity is one that optimally you're able to gain muscle mass and strength, but realistically at the maximum you're stalling the loss that is probably inevitable, or you're slowing it down maximally. And as you age, it's definitely the case that you do not recover from exercise at the same rate, because you don't have the same metabolic rate that you did when you were young. You're just not as hormonally capable of recovery. So as you age, monitoring volume and frequency becomes even more important.
Right. Yeah. Well, Don, this has been incredibly helpful and great to get your specific take on some of these topics. Really appreciate you taking the time, being so generous with your knowledge. If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on Carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered, or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at CarnivoreCast, or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.